One problem facing people at many levels of business is how to make time for a work life and a personal life. Do you find that one seems to keep getting in the way of the other? This is the Work-Life Balance with Rick Morris. Even if you're not involved in the business world, you'll have a lot to gain by tuning in to today's show. Now, here is your host, Rick Morris.
Life Balance on a Friday afternoon. We're so excited to have everybody along with us. It's been another great week for R Square Consulting. A lot of speaking engagements this week. I did like 4 different podcasts. So watch our page as we'll link those out when they become available. But did a lot of recording this week. It was a lot of fun. And just a couple of reminders. Next week, the PMI Virtual Expo, there's literally like 250,000 people that join this virtual conference. I will be your host, taking you through that. That's going to be on June 13th. You can go to projectmanagement.com or PMI.org to find out more information about the PMI Expo. And then we've got a few more speaking engagements coming up in June. One in Minneapolis on the 17th. And then, of course, we'll be going out to Boston right before the July 4th week. So we hope that you'll always follow the page at rickamorris.com and find out where we're going to be and join us. Now, today we've got a very exciting guest, and she is an author of Crisis Ready, Building an Invincible Brand in an Uncertain World. She's a leading authority on crisis preparedness, reputation management, and brand protection. She's a coveted speaker, commentator, and advisor to some of today's leading organizations faced with the greatest risk. And I had an opportunity to catch her TED Talk, which was amazing. As a strategic advisor and keynote speaker, she's worked with NATO, Ministries of Foreign Affairs and Defense, financial firms, technology companies, healthcare organizations, cities and municipalities, law enforcement agencies, global nonprofits, basically anybody in business, she's talked to them. And she helps them understand risk and build invincible brands that can withstand even the most devastating of events. I'd love to bring her on the show right now, Melissa Agnes. How are you, Melissa?
I'm well, Rick. How are you?
Doing good. So we just did a little introduction, but introduce yourself to our audience. Tell them a little bit about how you got here.
My strong point, talking about myself. The story of how I got here. So I've been an entrepreneur my entire adult life since I was 21. And
you're only 22 now, so about a year.
It's just been a couple years.
Sure.
And apparently I'm not good at math, so 21 to 28 was a couple years. So I kind of floated around for a bit, and about 8-9 years ago, I was doing brand strategies right at the cusp of when organizations realized that, they should be on social and they could leverage that. And I remember the day that it happened. So I have a brain the way that my brain works is in a pattern. It sees risk everywhere. It sees mitigation strategies for that risk, and then it sees opportunity through the mitigation. It's like if I were to put my brain in a linear fashion, that is the pattern of its working. And so I remember one morning I was, reading and doing everything that I do. And it struck me as odd that nobody was talking about the risk of social media, of technology, of the real-time news cycle. And of course, then my mind went to the mitigation strategies of that risk and then the opportunities through those mitigation strategies. And that kind of triggered something inside of me where I spent a year just devouring everything that I could on the topic of crisis management, which before that day, I didn't know was a thing. I didn't know that there were crisis management professionals. And I kept turning, I had a business partner at the time, and I kept turning to him and I kept saying, there's something here, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it until one morning, one of my clients, we had just launched their website. They were a real estate investment trust. Their VP calls me very early one morning in a panic saying, Melissa, the president of the company is in the car with a prospective investor. The radio is reporting that one of our buildings is about to explode. It's not true. Investors keep calling in. They're panicked. They want to know what's going on. Apparently, the rumor started on Twitter. We have no idea what Twitter is, but we hear it's a digital thing. And since you just launched our website, we thought to call you.
Wow.
So kind of whirlwind of a moment. Anyways, I went in within a half an hour. I had the media correcting themselves. I had the information correct on Twitter, but investors weren't going to Twitter. So I had investors receiving the right information because they weren't going to Twitter at that point in time. Anyways, long story short, the next day, the president of the company calls me and says, not only did our unit price not go down since yesterday, but it actually went up a cent. Thank you so much. And that was when I realized people need this. Organizations, that was like the most useful I had ever felt, and I was really good at it. And people needed it, and they didn't even realize they needed it yet. So I launched a blog. That was my marketing strategy. I didn't have a big budget back then. And I decided, I dedicated myself to blogging 5 days a week to start raising questions that I didn't understand weren't being raised, why they weren't being raised at that point in time. And mine was the first blog in the world to do that to that level, which was right place, right time. I had the opportunity, the advantage of having some really wonderful crisis management professionals, long-standing careers, great client lists come to me. And it's funny because they turned and they said, we're not sure if this whole social technology thing is a fad or a trend and how long it's going to last. And we're nearing retirement, so we don't necessarily want to learn it, but we're smart enough to know that our clients need you and your services now. Can we partner? So I got these wonderful mentors that kind of showed me the ropes and opened up their client list to me. And I built, from there.
That's amazing. It's a great story. And it's interesting how technology has flipped things.
Yeah.
And it's for both sides though, right? So for every good thing, there's a bad thing, but we've never had more access to be able to get at a brand than we do right now because of Twitter or Facebook. And I have a story where, I'll make it very quick, but I was a brand loyal person to Jaguar, and I had a bad car and they wouldn't fix it. And so to make a long story short, they closed the case, and I just tweeted something out that I was frustrated about it. And I put them in the hashtag, and they called me right away. And there was a young lady who made a huge mistake, right? Because she goes, well, every time you tweet something, it comes across my desk. And I was like, ooh, see, I have automated tweet services. So I went and found every negative article I could find on Jaguar and started not only having me tweet it, but my celebrity friends tweet it. And within 2 weeks, we had a settlement for the car. But they cared more about the brand image on Twitter than keeping a long-time customer, right? And that was something I saw from a crisis point.
But you raise a really, really good point. That's not it's a crisis point when it escalates to crisis. That's a cultural point, right? So there's this disconnect, and it's starting to be bridged now. But that goes to since United Breaks Guitars by Dave Carroll, since the Domino's pizza fiasco. Both incidents happened in 2009. Since those incidents kind of catapulted, or the awakening of consumers have a voice and a platform to raise that voice, and that voice can be echoed and its reach is global instantaneously. There was this disconnect where we're going to respond on social and we're not going to respond via email or via telephone or loyalty programs with long-standing customers, only new customers, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a good point.
But it really can come at you from anywhere, right? I mean, that's
yes.
All of us, again, somebody just leading a Twitter campaign, and the next thing you know, I've seen a lot of stuff on the web where companies were trying to be cute with Twitter and then just did something, really dumb, right? Really insensitive, or and it just completely, blows things up. That is what you consider crisis, correct?
No, that would be
tell me what
not necessarily.
Help me.
So there's a difference between an issue and a crisis. And this is essential for organizations to realize and for their teams to understand and to know how to evaluate. Issues can go viral and not reach crisis level. So that's important. The difference being that a crisis is a negative event or situation that stops business as usual to some extent. It stops business as usual because it needs to be escalated all the way up to leadership. It needs leadership's guidance, decision-making directives. Why? Because the incident threatens long-term negative impact on one or all of the following 5 things. People, so stakeholders, the environment, business operations, the organization's reputation, and or the organization's bottom line. So it's that long-term negative impact, I'm underscoring the word long-term, negative impact on one or all of those 5 things, which stops business as usual. Whereas an issue is, even if it goes viral, is business as usual on hyperdrive. It's, customer service on hyperdrive. It's social media engagement on hyperdrive. It's whatever it is on hyperdrive. It does not need to be escalated straight up to leadership because it does not threaten that long-term material impact. Now, it can if it's mismanaged. Issues need to be managed effectively, and actually issues are beautiful opportunities for organizations to live their values and to communicate and act in ways that actually connects them closer with those who matter most to their business. But still, viral issues doesn't necessarily equal crisis. And it's so essential for teams to be able to detect, assess, and then respond in real time.
That was awesome. And now I know the difference.
Was blank there for a second.
No, it was great.
Registering.
It wasn't blank. It was enthrallment, if that means anything. So we're actually going to go ahead and take a break here. But if you guys haven't picked up on this, Melissa is absolutely an expert, knows what she's talking about. This is going to be an extremely. We are back to the work-life balance. On this Friday afternoon, we're visiting with Melissa Agnes, and she has got a book out called Crisis Ready: Building an Invincible Brand in an Uncertain World. And I'm sure you can find that anywhere, right, Melissa? Find it on Amazon, right directly from your website. What is your website, by the way?
melissaagnes.com.
There you go. There you go. So if you're looking for Melissa, you can find her there. So right before we went to break, we were talking about the difference between an issue and a crisis. But what does it really mean to be crisis ready? And how does that translate into brand invincibility, like you said?
Crisis ready is synonymous for brand invincibility. Crisis ready is more than just crisis management. When your team is crisis ready, it means that and I mean the entire team, the entire organization, understands instinctively how to detect a rising risk in real time. They are empowered and trained to assess its material impact. So is it an issue versus is it a crisis? And then they're equipped to not just manage the incident in a way that puts it to bed, but managing it in a way that actually increases the trust and the credibility and the goodwill in the organization. So therefore, the synonymous part with brand invincibility is that if you're crisis ready and your team can take any blow and take and whether it's an issue, a day-to-day issue, straight through to catastrophic crisis, and respond in a way that actually increases stakeholder trust and credibility and goodwill in the brand, then you can weather any storm and you become invincible.
So what is it, as an organization, what are some of the common mistakes that we can make in a crisis, and how do we avert some of those?
By not being crisis ready. What does that mean?
By not hiring you directly.
Here's the risk of not being crisis ready. I mean, there's so many mistakes to be made. And the reason is that today, with social media, with technology, with the real-time news cycle, with two-way communication, stakeholders have higher demands. The threshold for the demands that we have as consumers in organizations, in brands, starts at a much higher level than it ever did before. And it starts at minute one. So it used to be that organizations could rely on a crisis management plan, which is a term that I never use. I really, really don't like that term. A plan is linear and it sits on a shelf or in a file. A program is cultural and is intrinsic and is cultivated every single day. So it used to be that, organizations would rely on that plan, and they would think that in the event of a crisis, they could just pull this plan, open it up, and it'd guide them through to crisis management success. But the reality today is that by the time you reach for that plan, you're already playing catch up. Right? The story is already potentially miles ahead of you. The media is already picking up on it. Stakeholder expectations are already surging. The phones are already ringing. Social media is already being extremely loud and overwhelming. So if you're going to rely on a plan, you're putting your team at a disadvantage. Whereas being crisis ready means that your team instinctively detected it right from the start, so you have a chance to get ahead of it. They understood how to assess it, and assessing it means that they understand how to the correct response for it, and then they understand how to respond. So they understand what stakeholders expect in the brand, so what their main concerns are, what they care about, how to reach them effectively in their pockets, which is one of the beauties of technology today, in a way, again, that increases that trust and credibility in the organization, in the brand. That makes sense?
Absolutely. And so I work in project management, and a lot of us, look at what you're supposed to be doing for projects and work with cultures of organizations. What we find a lot is the cultures want the results, but won't do the work necessary to get there. Are you finding that a lot? Is crisis ready something? Is it something that people are being reactive to become proactive? right? Does that make sense?
So it does make sense. I'm extremely fortunate because the clients that I have are willing to do the work. And it kind of goes to people, right? So, I mean, this is the work-life balance podcast. People as human beings, there are some people who want to achieve certain things, whether it's external success or internal, working on yourself, aren't prepared to do the work and just never achieve, versus those who do the work every day, and whether it's internally or externally, and do achieve. Same with being crisis ready. And what the beauty with crisis ready is that it's a culture of putting people first. It's one of my crisis ready rules: people above process and bottom line, always. And that's a beautiful culture. Intrinsically, like straight through, that's a beautiful culture, internally, externally. And it's, there's this, so I have the crisis ready model, which is the 5 phases that I take with organizations to help them become crisis ready. So that's the structure of the book. It takes you through each of those 5 phases. And the reality is, so it's the crisis ready model is this, contextual model that's a triangle. But once you reach that pinnacle, once you've reached that, you've ingrained this culture. You've done so much work. You've uncovered so much. You've been through so much team building and all of these wonderful things that now it becomes a part of the culture. And it's not this pinnacle anymore. It's just this ever-flowing process that's ingrained in the culture, which is when you truly do become crisis ready.
Yeah, and we talk a lot on this show about culture and vision, right? And that culture will eat vision for lunch. So you can have a vision for being crisis ready, but if you don't establish a culture to do so, then you're not going to be successful at all.
No.
So coming back to some of those common mistakes, right? Do you have a couple of examples that maybe you could share, or?
Of things like not to do that, or the most common.
Yeah, the most common things that people do.
There's 2 most common mistakes that I see consistently. The first is delayed communication. And that is very easy to do in this day and age, but there's an expectation of, well, basically the longer you take to respond effectively, let's underscore the term effectively, to a viral issue or a crisis, the more control over the incident you lose, the more control over the narrative of the story you lose, the more stakeholder trust and credibility you risk losing, and the more crisis response penalty you suffer. And the crisis response penalty, the CRP, is a term I coined, and it basically evaluates the short and long-term monetary and reputational impact of a crisis on an organization as a direct result of their ineffective response. And I'll make that real. If we look at, do you remember the incident that United faced last year with Dr. Dow, when he was brutally dragged off? Another one of my crisis ready rules is always assume there's video. So that went viral within seconds, right? That was captured on video, went viral internationally within seconds. It took United 2 days to issue an effective response. They had 3 responses within the span of those 2 days, but it took them 2 days to issue an effective response. And over the span of those 2 days, they suffered a lot of repercussions as a result of this incident. But if we just want to look at the monetary short-term hit, over the span of those 2 days, they watched their market capitalization drop by $1.4 billion. So if we look at the CRP in terms of a correlation or an equation looking at time of response with direct monetary impact, that's a $700 million a day mistake.
Wow. And so one that's in the news, quite a bit lately too. And it's the news cycles are crazy now because it seems like people just lose their muster for the follow through of the story, right? Because to United's point, by the time they apologized, everybody was already just mad and moved on, right? They didn't care anymore to a point.
This one they did.
Yeah,
especially their Asian market.
No, that I absolutely get. But like the Starbucks story, which continues to dominate news cycles and still go through. What did you think of that response, or did you think that was a main mistake?
This one is interesting. So I talk often in chapter 4, I go through it in my book. high-risk scenarios. So once you've defined issue versus crisis for your organization, because a crisis for one company doesn't necessarily translate into a crisis for another. Once you've defined your definitions, then it's really essential that you look at or you identify what your most likely high-impact scenarios are, both in terms of issue and in crisis. One of the things that organizations often overlook are societal trends. And that's what we saw with Starbucks. We didn't see Starbucks look it. We saw them actually not overlook it, do the opposite in response to what happened. But okay, let me kind of backtrack. Right now we have a societal trend where our society collectively, our culture has said, between the Me Too movement, the Time's Up, as well as racial discrimination. As a society, we have decided collectively that we are not going to stand for any of these things anymore. This creates high-risk scenario that is more prevalent to organizations when those that are vulnerable to it. So let me ask you this, Rick. How many times a day around the world do you think that not just Starbucks, but any coffee shop, any retail store, any restaurant, any type of B2C, interacting, front-facing, storefront type of business, do things like this occur? And like this, to clarify for viewers and listeners, is the Starbucks thing. Two Black men were waiting for their friend before they bought coffee and asked to use the washroom. They were told, no, they have to buy something. They said, we're waiting for our friend. The police were called and they were dragged out in not dragged out, but they were taken out in handcuffs for loitering and that. And what was caught on camera were the standard buys. And you can hear the white people recording saying, I'm white. I'm doing the same thing they're doing. Why aren't you arresting me? Right? The reason that took so much momentum or gained so much momentum is because of the societal trend that we're not going to stand for that anymore. We're calling it out and we're shutting it down. Starbucks, the way that they responded to it was a statement, was a stance to stand in solidarity with this movement and to say, we take this seriously. We're going to go above and beyond and do everything in our power to not have a culture where this is acceptable. So it's an interesting case.
And they traded revenue for that, right? So they not only just wasn't like, oh, we're going to do diversity training, don't worry about it. By shutting down the stores, there were people that are like, I want my coffee and couldn't interact. I thought that was a very interesting response.
It was, and we have to understand why. They could have done it so many other ways. That was a conscious choice, and it was for that. It was to show that they stand in support of, we don't stand for discrimination against anybody. And if we want to just kind of one extra point there is that another high-risk scenario is the fact that we don't control people, right? Yeah. So Starbucks has thousands upon thousands of employees, probably millions of employees working for them every day. And we cannot control, we can have a rogue employee is a high risk scenario for a lot of organizations. So it's these two factors that they're now trying to mitigate against.
And that's an important thing about the brand, right? Is sometimes I feel like in the news cycles, though, we don't separate that, right? Because this became the Starbucks thing versus that idiot in the store, right? To a point too,
Starbucks'
right?
responsibility. They're accountable for it.
Totally agree. But we also, wanting to separate people sometimes, you have to go look and go, this isn't our culture, and, ask that person. But at the same time, I feel like sometimes we bundle it a little bit too tightly.
And yeah, if those people were called out, I mean, first of all, if Starbucks would have called them out, that would have been scapegoating. That would have been
totally agree with that.
Brought through I'm terrible at analogies, but, criticized for it. The other thing too is, and my brain goes to risk, right? So the physical safety of those people would have been put in question, and
totally agree with that. Yeah. So I'm not advocating naming names.
Yeah. No, I hear you.
Means, right.
I hear you.
I just wonder sometimes as a society, do we, even though we understand it's our responsibility, you can only train so much, and you can only, right. And you get rid of the bad employees. But I got to imagine that, the world's largest bank, there's a couple of people that don't have great societal views working for them, right? Until that opportunity presents itself to get rid of it. How do you do that? So we'll come back on the break on that point, because it looks like you're about to debate me, and I love it.
Oh no, I was just going to bring up Wells Fargo, but yeah.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah. There it is. So we're going to take our break right here. We're with Melissa Agnes. She's our crisis ready expert. We're learning a ton today, so stay with us right after the break. You're listening to the Work-Life Balance.
Now back to the Work-Life Balance.
And we're back to the Work-Life Balance on this Friday afternoon. We're visiting with Melissa Agnes, and she is teaching us a tremendous amount about being crisis ready. So I just, no more announcements. Let's just get back to it. So we were talking about the societal view, right? Yep. And we collectively as a society, how much of that is based on emotion, though? Right? Sometimes it's outrage, sometimes it's fake outrage, sometimes it's, piling on, those types of things. But emotion, I think, plays a big part in crisis, in issue management. And what do you do with that?
Okay, so I have two really, really important points to make. The first is I talked about, identifying and assessing a risk. Understand, teaching your team to identify and assess the emotional relatability of a situation is essential for understanding if it's going to be an issue that remains kind of just low-key issue versus issue that goes viral versus crisis. The emotional relatability is what sends something going viral. And when emotional relatability is very negative and we haven't talked about Crockpot, right?
Not yet, yeah.
Okay, so look at Crockpot. Did you see what happened with Crockpot earlier this year? Okay, so for viewers, for listeners, Crockpot woke up to a storm on social, and not just on social. They were talked about, they made international news. It was on morning talk shows. Basically, This Is Us, the show, the television show, finally revealed how one of their main characters, Jack Pearson, died. He died because the show's very old, or the family's very old slow cooker, not a crockpot machine, a generic slow cooker, short-circuited, set the house to flames, and Jack died of smoke inhalation. Now, we're talking about emotional relatability. So how did Crockpot get dragged into this? Crockpot got dragged into this because viewers at home, so I had never even heard of the show before. I'm not a TV person. But I went and I watched this 5-minute segment once everything was going viral, when I woke up to this news. And that I had never seen the show before. And this TV segment, this story was so beautifully crafted that it brought me into it, that it drew me in and almost brought me to tears just by watching. So never mind people who are emotionally involved with this TV series, right? That never miss an episode. So they're at home with their families. They're watching this show. They're so emotionally compelled by the story. And then they realize, oh my goodness, I have a crockpot machine. I don't want my family to die. So that's that emotional relatability, right? Where they get brought into it. It's completely irrational. But it doesn't matter. It's emotional, so therefore it's real. And as a result, Crockpot woke up to a storm of their customers saying, we're going to throw out our crockpot machines and never buy another one. We're going to boycott this brand forever. Emotional relatability. Go ahead. I'll let you talk.
I was just saying, it's an amazing story, right? Because it
is an amazing story.
It's a fictional thing.
Yeah. And I talk about, your high risk scenarios and identifying them. The beauty of crisis readiness is that, say you have 8 high risk scenarios and you are ready for them. You've done the digging and everything that's involved in becoming ready for those, preventing the preventable, managing or preparing for the unpreventable. And this 9th scenario, like Crockpot, that nobody in a million years could have ever anticipated. It wasn't even a crockpot machine. It was specifically this was not product placement, right? And yet Crockpot was crisis ready. And when you're crisis ready for the 8 scenarios that are the most likely high impact to occur, you're crisis ready for the 9th, 10th, 11th that you could not have even fathomed because your team instinctively knows what to do.
So what was the response by Crockpot to that?
Crockpot was
follow that story.
Okay, and it goes actually to my second point of emotion. So firstly, Crockpot was not even on Twitter when this broke. So they had flown so far under the radar for so long, decades, that they weren't even on Twitter. So the 3 steps, right? Detect, assess, respond in a way that increases stakeholder trust. That's being crisis ready. They detected it early on, right away. They jumped on Twitter. Now, the beauty is that how many organizations could have and probably would have looked at it and said, come on, people. In the history of Crock-Pot, this has never happened before. Our machines are designed to not let this happen. You're being irrational. And either they'd come out and say that in some form, or they would say that behind the scenes internally and be like, we're not going to respond to this. This is ridiculous, right? It's going to go away. But it's by assessing that emotional relatability to realize that this isn't going to go away. If we let it go away, not only are we going to miss this incredible opportunity to connect on that emotional level with our customers, but this emotion is going to reside within them, and our brand will forever be tainted reputationally to some extent because it's going to have that emotional connection, negative emotional connection tied to it. That was the risk here. And so that's assessing the emotional relatability. And then you have to also know, another crisis ready rule is you can never trump emotion with logic. So you can't just come out and say, guys, you're being ridiculous. Here's all of the facts. Here's all of the studies. Here's all of the reports. This has never happened in the history of Crock-Pot. Never once has our machine, short-circuited and set flames to a home. You can't do that because people are emotional and they're not going to hear the logic. You're not going to trump emotion with logic. So what Crock-Pot did and why they were or another reason why they're so crisis ready is that they came at it with emotional intelligence. They understood this. So they jump on Twitter, and I'm paraphrasing here, but they said, basically, our hearts are broken with you. We're devastated that Jack died, and this is how he died. We can't believe it. So they validated the emotion that their customers were feeling. And then they continued that by saying, but we want you to know, we need you to know that we care about your family. And this is, Crock-Pot is designed to never let this be your reality. And here is the logic. Here's the stats. Here's the studies. Here's the proof that this has never happened. And it's only by doing that people opened up their hearts to let them into their minds in that very irrational, that place of irrational emotion that is so deep. And you're talking about a fear of killing your family, right? And I'm being very drastic here, but that's the fear. That's what the reality of the situation was. And Crock-Pot was crisis ready. They detected it, they assessed it, and they responded with emotional intelligence, which de-escalated it from crisis level or potential crisis level to issue level to an opportunity to connect further on an emotional level with their customers.
And so we do a lot, and you and I on pre-show when we talked about this in disc profiles, and one of the things that we teach a lot of our project managers is to recognize that some people think task-wise and some people think people-wise, right? So they're half of the people out there will sacrifice the relationship to get a task done. The other half will sacrifice the task for the relationship. And so is it important to kind of have both of those going in a crisis, right? You said it a little bit.
Yeah, what I loved about our pre-call conversation, Rick, was you said something to me that nobody has ever said, which was that the rational people, so not the emotional. Say, let's look at the logical people who knew that this was a story, a fictional story, and it's not going to happen to them. They didn't care about it. Your question to me was, did Crock-Pot overreact in their minds? Do you remember?
Yeah.
Did they come across as too emotional? And it's funny because the people that are, so I'm a very logical person. I'm more logical than I am emotional. And the people who are more logical, who talked to me about it afterwards, said, I thought that they were being ironic. Like, I thought they were joking. So, which kind of brought full circle when you asked me that question. It was, no, you need to respond to the emotion here. The logical people aren't jumping the fence. They're not throwing out their Crock-Pot. They're not at risk of throwing out their Crock-Pot and never buying from you again. So you're speaking to the emotional people. But in turn, the rational, logical people that didn't get swayed by emotion are looking at it and kind of having fun with it as well.
Yeah, but I would still think that they would want to see the facts and figures, right? At the end of the day, they're like,
yeah. Those facts and figures were there. Absolutely.
And that was my point, right? Is kind of having both. You validated the emotion, which got you past that, but then you still followed it up with the logical side so that people
Which is what they did. Yeah. And you need to do that. Otherwise, nobody's going to believe. So in order to successfully manage a viral issue or a crisis, you have to do the following two things simultaneously extremely well. And that is, the first is action, the actions that you take behind the scenes to actually manage the crisis. In this case, that's the facts, right? Those are the actions that they've already taken to make sure that a crisis like this doesn't happen. And then is the communication. You have to do both of those simultaneously and very, very well. In terms, you can't do one without the other. We brought on, we talked about Wells Fargo, we brought them up right before the break. Wells Fargo has a cultural crisis. That's what happened. And they tried to manage it via only communications. Brilliant, beautifully strategized communications. But the crisis didn't start to get managed until they actually took action. And it was a cultural crisis. Culture starts from the top. They need to get rid of their CEO. Point final. And they tried to do the communications for months, or let's say weeks to a couple months, before they finally realized, okay, we have to take action. You can't do one without the other. It has to be simultaneous, and both have to be really, really strong.
And you just said something that just correct me up. Point final, though. That's
my
end of discussion. You can't even debate me. Point final.
Yeah. Well,
He's out.
Story.
But I'm never going to win an argument with you. I promise. I won't even try. That's good stuff. That was great. And so we've got about 2 minutes before the break. Again, tell people how to get in touch with you. Where can they find this book? Where can they learn more about all? Because there's a ton here that we're not even going to be able to cover in an hour.
MelissaAgnes.com is the best place to go. From there, you will find links to the book. The book was designed to be a fun, engaging read for the entire team, because crisis readiness is cultural. So you can order book through me at a discount, or you can go to Amazon and find Crisis Ready, Building an Invincible Brand in an Uncertain World, as well as all kinds of free resources on melissaagnes.com, blogs, videos, podcasts, downloads, you name it. There's a wealth of information there,
including her TED Talk, which is phenomenal. I highly suggest you guys go out and take a look at that as well. So we're going to take our final break right here. We'll be right back with Melissa Agnes. You're listening to Rick Morris on the Work-Life Balance. And we're back to the work-life balance. What's great about having the Zoom conference now, and if you guys haven't caught on, you can actually watch us live via Zoom or Facebook Live as we do the show, is I get to see my guests dancing to that music that comes in, which I only paid $250,000 for, and that's a whole nother story of brand readiness. But coming back, but I always shout out the party, my crew and my gang. I appreciate you guys for putting that together. But coming back, when we were talking earlier, we were talking about two common mistakes, and I think I cut you off and didn't let you get into the second one. So I'd love to hear what the second common mistake is.
You didn't cut me off. The conversation got enthralling. The second mistake that I most commonly see is employees are an afterthought. And that is a short and sweet. That is resolved by having head of HR have a seat at the crisis management table.
I love that. In fact, the whole point of work-life balance, and the reason why we do the show is what we feel is mistreatment a lot of times of the employees, or employees being afterthought, because we're driving dates and we're driving activity without a plan. And so people are working nights and weekends for things that don't even really matter. So for some reason, our work-life balance has just gone, out the window.
Work-life balance? What? What's that?
Yeah. I was going to say, now there's us who have our own company and our passion is our purpose. Mm-hmm. And so that's different, right? It's different than being mandated by a boss or a fear of losing a job.
Yes.
And you don't understand why, right? Every time I'm up here and working, I know why I'm doing it, right? And I know what the outcome is going to be. So I think that's interesting that you say employees are afterthought, because I think a lot of times they are.
They are, and that's a risk in and of itself.
So one of the big questions we like to ask all of our guests is, what is some of the greatest advice you've ever received?
All right. We receive so much advice, right? As humans and as entrepreneurs, I suppose too, with who we surround ourselves with. This question, there's only ever one answer that comes to mind. And it's an interesting one for me. It goes to back when I was about 8 or 9 years old. My grandmother told me, put your shoulders back, keep your chin up. And if you're not feeling happy, smile anyways, happiness will follow. And it's funny because somebody asked me, I was on another interview recently, and it was the first time this question was asked to me. And that's the only thing I could think of. And then I kept thinking about it afterwards, and I realized that is very much a part of who I am as a crisis management professional. But I am a crisis manager. That's who I am as a person. So that's the best advice I think that has, or the long-lasting, ingrained advice.
That's
I've
beautiful.
received.
I think when we were laughing about work-life balance, you've got your phone has got to ring at just the most ridiculous hour for the most up.
Yeah, well, you know what? My clients are crisis ready, which means that they don't have crises. I'm knocking on wood. So I'm very lucky for that. Well, work with them for that. The worst thing was when I had my number at the top of my website and it said in a crisis call, and then I was getting calls in the middle of the night, but by suicidal people, like people who need help that I can't give them. And that was something to, I ended up sleeping with the suicide hotline number next to my bed so that I was ready for them.
Good grief.
Because that's not, what I can do, but I can send them. So I removed that.
we were talking about my little crisis of the other company taking my name, and I'm getting all the phone calls about fraudulent credit cards. So if you're listening to me right now, I'm not that R Squared Consulting. I promise you that.
And that's good to know. So my kind of risk, thing for that is that could potentially, depending on how corrupt and how far-reaching this company is that's screwing people over, can potentially negatively impact your reputation, whether you like it or not. So something to be aware of. And if you want to chat offline, I can kind of just help you be ready for that.
Absolutely. And so are there any final comments that you'd like to share with the audience?
I will leave with this one thing. If ever you don't know what to do when faced with a negative situation, be it an issue or a crisis, if you always focus on putting people first, internally and externally, if you always focus on taking actions and steps towards strengthening and rebuilding relationships and trust, then you will always lead your team in the right direction.
Leadership is all trust, right?
Yeah.
And again, I belong to a segment when we were talking DISC. I have to 100% trust my leader for me to follow them, right? I can't blindly follow anybody. And that's probably why I own my own company. I don't even trust the leader of that all the time. But the point being, I don't trust myself and my own decisions. No, it's important how much trust plays into everything that we do, whether we're doing strategic planning or whether we're doing crisis ready planning. And so I love that part. And one of the biggest people that I've looked up to in that scenario is John Maxwell.
Okay.
And his books and in the things that he writes, because it's all about connection with people. He's got a book, Everybody Communicates, Few Connect. And so he's been such a bright light and mentor to me. I've been blessed to get a chance to hear some of the things he says. He gave me my favorite advice as well, which came from Carl Jung. It's like, until you make the subconscious conscious, it'll rule your life and you will call it fate. So to us, it's about finding blind spots and improving those.
I love that.
You like that?
That's so real.
I know. Once you get it, once that quote sunk into me, I was all in.
I live my life. I live my personal life that way. And that is just so beautifully articulated.
It's Carl Jung. It's an old quote, but man, does it make a lot of sense for me. So,
Carl Jung.
Melissa, you have been an absolute pleasure. We got to have you back soon. You promise to come back?
Yes, please.
All right. So again, you can go to melissaagnes.com and find out all about Melissa. If you're looking to become crisis ready, this is the person to talk to. I've met a lot of people in this industry and nobody like you, Melissa. And that's coming from the heart. You're fantastic at what you do.
Thank you. I appreciate that, Rick.
And so coming up next week, we're actually going to have a great friend of mine, Chris Rollins, on the phone. And we were talking about DISC here. He is one of the profound DISC experts. So we're going to talk about how to utilize DISC, how to really understand DISC so that you can start to build your professional profile and communicate at a different level. So Chris is a lot of fun. He talks faster than I do, so it's going to be a really, really quick and entertaining show. But we're going to have Chris Rollins on with us next week. And as always, we're here for you every Friday on the Voice America Business Network with the Work-Life Balance. You can find us at R2 Consulting on the Facebook page and be able to see this live, or you can go to rickamorris.com/voiceamerica and register to be part of the Zoom broadcast with any of our guests that are coming up. So we'd love to have you. You get to see us and see the hand movements that come with it. So when Melissa did Point Finale, you got the full piece of that. So we hope that you'll join us in all these different formats, and we look forward to talking to you next Friday. You've been listening to Rick Morris, The Work-Life Balance.
Thank you for joining us this week. The Work-Life Balance with Rick Morris can be heard live every Friday at 2 p.m. Pacific Time and 5 p.m. Eastern Time on the Voice America Business Channel. Now that the weekend is here, it's time to rethink your priorities and enjoy it. We'll see you on our next show.